the API review question out of steering.
Well, we can't make any binding decisions, but
It looks like, looking at the version history, it looks like Joe is the one who added it.
Yeah, I think definitely there's weird lines. I think it requires just more wordsmithing in the doc. And as long as we can agree on some wordsmithing in SIG-Arch, I don't think this should be a big problem.
Yeah, I was kind of hoping that if there was any like fundamental questions that came out of it, like we debated at SIG-Arch, and if we felt that there was a process problem in SIG-Arch or a scope problem, it could go to steering if really necessary. But it seems like a SIG-Arch because I think we delegated definition of what Kubernetes is to SIG-Arch. So
yep, we definitely did. When I reread the doc, though, it goes beyond the scope. So
yeah, and API governance and API review are under the SIG-Arch, the specific SIG-Arch subproject as well. Yeah. I haven't looked at the recent discussion, but I didn't expect it to come up here. But yeah, and we should put it on the agenda for SIG-Arch, I think, is the action item here.
Yeah. I already did, actually.
Okay.
I did have a separate topic that I thought I wanted to raise awareness and get feedback from, is that this came in from the wild. And I was kind of wondering, like, who from the Kubernetes space has any say or has governance or oversight into the CIS benchmarks? And like, who does that report into through, like, are the SIG structure? Because
SIG auth, that's the computer information security ones?
Yeah.
The SIG auth, they've worked with them. I don't know that they probably, as much as anybody, own the relationship with the CIS benchmarks, since they also technically own making the recommendations for security on Kubernetes from a feature capability perspective. Although I guess, Brandon, I mean, like, do you think the security group also has a tie in there?
Okay. The reason I ask is because we got a bunch of, we got some reports back in from the wild for deployments. And one of the things we found is that as we dug into the benchmarks, we found that like a bunch of the benchmarks were really bad or wrong.
They're horrible.
They're terrible. Yeah. So I was like, who owns this? And we have no idea who actually owns it, because
the problem is CIS actually owns them, right? And so the best that we can do is advise them. And if they want to make some horrible recommendation, it's kind of out of our control. And so I remember very distinctly trying through folks at CoreOS who were sitting on SIG auth, who were sitting on the CIS like advisory committee, helping to explain why certain things were not recommended. And they just were very stringent on wanting the like tightest possible, almost non-working set of standards. So it's like, if they want to recommend something that's terrible, that's not really something we can manage, we can put up a blog post or something saying these are terrible, and as a community we reject these standards.
Yeah, I think the expectation from the community was the big one that was weird, because they kind of publicized themselves as like, you know, the standard bearer for what is Kubernetes deployment. And I think some people actually expected that a lot of deployments would pass CIS benchmarks, and were surprised by the results they got back.
So, yeah, I mean, CIS has always been kind of a bad organization, I mean, in my opinion. And I mean, their recommendations for Linux are terrible too, but what are you going to do?
So yeah, I kind of seen the same thing, that you see people with configurations or attempting to make configurations for a cluster to be compliant with running the CIS benchmarks, and effectively configuring the cluster in that way for the workloads they're trying to run makes the control plane unstable by default. So I think one of the real issues might be is that if we do nothing, there's a potential that the sort of the compliance standard for security for a cluster generates clusters that are unstable for our users.
I suggest we delegate this issue to one of the SIGs, and if it doesn't stick, we can take it up again. It sounds like SIG auth is.
Yeah, I think that SIG auth is the appropriate forum for this, given previous involvement, and if there's any support that they need more, like, I think the concern that I'm hearing there is more of an urgency, like these are bad and we should fix them, which SIGAUTH should own. But if we need to help from an urgency or communications perspective, we can.
Yeah, and if they come with a specific request, then we can help them with it. But I don't see a specific request. I just see concern.
Agreed.
Yep.
SIGAUTH and SIG API Machinery and SIG Node are all kind of each own pieces that the CIS benchmark addresses. And we've consistently, at least from SIGAUTH and SIG API Machinery, I've consistently given feedback on particular guidelines and have seen very little movement. So I'm not sure what else we can and should do.
So I guess the other thing I would give to Tim is, if you go back to SIGAUTH and tell them we're seeing some issues, I think we can also just market that SIGAUTH or a set of authors don't agree with the standard, and just I think if people are having trouble with the standards and it's actively causing SIGs issues, it's okay to not just be polite and continue to slowly work with SIS. So that'd be my last piece of feedback.
I mean, some of the things that were recommended, we actually deprecated and removed because they didn't make sense and didn't work on any clusters. And so that's kind of the big hammer version. No one should ever set this setting ever. And if a benchmark's recommending it incorrectly, why do we even have that lever? So a few things have been done that way, but there's a long tail of stuff that they recommend that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, we've come across the long tail as well. So.
All right. So is that Brendan Burns? Do we have quorum?
Guess not.
Cool. Well, we don't have quorum and we're now officially out of topics. So should we call it?
Can I add a topic really quick?
Sure.
Can we talk about budget for Contributor Summit? It is Brendan Burns. Haha. We do have quorum. I just wanted to see when, where, what the platform is that we should discuss funding for Contributor Summit. We met with the CNCF crew yesterday to talk about the needs and to go through line by line as far as what we need. But we did not get to talk about the actual funding and where the money is coming from and the future considerations and things along those lines.
Is there now then a budget that you have seen and you and I presume Contributor Experience have vetted as actually what we need as opposed to pulled from whole cloth?
Yes. I mean, unfortunately, it's kind of a situation where we only had two options, but so we have to kind of do what we have to do. I feel like this one is definitely higher than anyone to date because of that. But I don't necessarily foresee that being a benchmark for the future either. But we do definitely have a number now. I know Deb Giles with CNCF is going to get some more firm quotes instead of the ranges, and then we'll have that information there. So I'd say within the next week tops, they'll have a more firm number. So at that point, do you feel like we could dive deeper into some solutions for sustainable funding?
So the information that was shared previously wasn't entirely clear to me what we were asking for, in terms of our objectives and what we plan to do and things like that. Some was speculation on the part of other people. So do we have a proposal about what we would like to do that's pretty fleshed out at this point?
No, we are working on that. We've set issues I can add those to the agenda, but we have a deadline of July 15th to send steering committee what we are intending of doing, but we're intending to have a full show here, and full show meaning all contributor personas represented in some kind of content value add to them. And we're specifically going to be focusing on current contributors and workshops and things to get folks trained on code reviews and things like that. So you'll see all that information July 15th, but we definitely have future intentions of making every contributor summit have goals and objectives like we did with Barcelona, because we just don't have the staff to run a full show, nor clearly do we have the budget to run a full show every year. So we want to be conscientious of that, essentially. So that's why Shanghai and Barcelona are a little bit on the cheaper end, because we expect that the North America shows are going to have much more participation and things like that. But you'll see it July 15th. That's our deadline. We're going to try for sooner, but that's our D-Day to get that to you.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it sounds like we should take a look through that to figure out where there are choices and what we're looking at.
All right.
Cool. Thanks for the update, Paris. So I guess one last thing is late yesterday, somebody submitted the first funding request to the funding repo. So we have to actually now figure out how we're going to do that.
Just-in-time process delivery.
Exactly. So I put a link in the notes. Yeah, so we never really talked much further than it just goes to steering. And we would approve it. So how are people feeling? Do we want to just have somebody volunteer to review it? Do we want to get quorum for $190 worth of expenditures?
Technically, we have quorum today, so we could now that we have Brendan, we have quorum, so we could approve this. And for something like $190, it strikes me as an obvious choice.
Any other thoughts? I'm not familiar with this SIG project at all, so I have no idea how significant it is or what it is. So
I don't know that this particular feature is widely used. So I don't know that it really needs its own logo. And I don't know how much it's worth debating about it, but it's
I would ask precedent, like, are we going to do logos for other things? Like KubeADM is user focused. What other things like this where? Like,
yeah, this is like, should the scheduler have a logo?
yeah.
Should the node problem detector have a logo? Should CAdvisor have a logo? CAdvisor may have a logo, but CAdvisor predates Kubernetes, so
and they drew it themselves.
yeah, I mean, this request, I have to say, doesn't really make sense to me, but
I'm a little skeptical of doing logos, but I understand, like, maybe if in the context of like visual community presence, like, I think that would be the best argument that would convince me would be a contribx or documentation reason to put more effort into visual presentation of our projects to convey things to users more effectively. But I don't know, users or contributors, but I don't know that this meets what I would consider.
yeah, I guess it would be contributor oriented rather than user oriented. Users shouldn't care about this.
Yeah. So I think Minikube, Kops, and KubeADM are the existing.
So the person who requested it is the main contributor to the project.
Got it.
And there's no other significant contributors.
All right. So we've heard from Clayton and Brian. Any other thoughts from the committee members?
Hi, Dims here. So looks like it's part of Signode, right? So should they have a say in this? Because they, according to the contributor, Signode hasn't talked about it yet. And it says requesting SIG is Signode.
Yeah. That's fair. I do think that we should consider whether we're going to even entertain like every part of the system having a logo, as Brian and Clayton.
There's a suggestion in the chat from Valerie saying common iconography would be nice. But continuing on, that the individual project logos don't solve that. So maybe we look to develop a common set of iconography across Kubernetes and invest that way instead of one-off logos.
Yeah, and the SIGs don't have logos. Should the SIGs have logos? That might make more sense than this one single contributor sub-project having a logo.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I would just say, you know, my proposal would be the answer should be no. I agree with the point that it should have been discussed in Signode first, but I think the answer would still be no. So, but at least that's my opinion.
Okay. Well, I'll summarize this discussion and put it in the comments.
Thank you.
Yep.
And if we just estimate the number of sub-projects, we probably have like 100 sub-projects on the project. Are we going to pay $200 for a logo for every sub-project?
Right.
I don't think we would.
All right. Well, I think we're out of agenda.
So I'm sorry I'm late, all. I don't want to relitigate the topic that I put on there and then didn't show up to talk about because I saw the notes. But the concern I did want to actually raise there, and we can actually see if this becomes a critical problem, it's really one of SIG autonomy. The idea of like what decisions are sort of, you know, within a SIG's purview, and what are some places where we actually have processes to curtail what SIGs can do. And I think the API review process is one of those things that talks about sort of what is the charter of a SIG and what is the ability for other SIGs like SIG architecture to actually impact and influence what's happening within a particular SIG. I mean, we can see if this practically becomes a problem, but I don't think this is purely a SIG architecture thing. This really is. And I think, you know, fundamentally also SIG architecture, because it does have so much impact across across the project, across other SIGs, really is pretty special here. There aren't other SIGs that have that kind of cross-cutting impact. So that's just a point I wanted to make sure got in there. Yeah, so release and scalability are, I think, are good ones, but I think release is really, it's a process thing. It's not an architectural thing. It doesn't actually tell SIGs what they can and can't do in total. It actually just talks about sort of like, how do we pull a release together? it gets to decide what goes in and out of a release, which is different than saying this is the architecture. I think scalability also has purview, but I think we've struggled honestly with giving scalability the purview to say something like feature XYZ shouldn't go in because it hurts scalability.
Although in practice, it actually has blocked that. There have been some debates, but I think scalability has vetoed and changed the implementation of tens of features I've been aware of.
Yeah, but I think it is one of these things where we don't actually have something like a scalability review that takes 6 weeks for every KEP.
That's fair. And Joe, another one that I think was brought up before you joined, or maybe just caught it, was we had delegated what is Kubernetes to SIG architecture. And so I'd say there's an aspect of this, which is what is Kubernetes? Is allowed to add things and not go through a process for SIG architecture says this is also part of Kubernetes. API reviews kind of doing some of that now. I think SIG architecture doesn't work as well as we would like, but starting there felt appropriate because we'd already delegated the.
And I'm cool with that. I just wanted to give a little bit of context of why I actually brought this to steering.
Well, API governance and API review also fall under SIG architecture. I actually think this was originally targeted at things completely outside the project, even though it was interpreted differently. Maybe it's targeting both. But much like we came up with the different types of repos for different types of work, it's possible that some kind of affordance may need to be made for things that will be user-facing and things that will not be user-facing. Like, we don't expect all Kubernetes users to consume PROW, so maybe it doesn't make sense for PROW to be kind of in the same API group namespace as the parts of Kubernetes that ship with the release. And that seems like something that distinctly falls under the governance of the API approvers.
Yeah, and I think also, practically making sure that, what is in scope for API approval versus not. Are we talking essentially syntax, making sure that it's well formed, it meets the conventions, versus weighing in on the core data model? And I think, having essentially a very small group of people that can veto the core data model of any SIG seems like, a bottleneck.
Do you want to speak to that, Jordan?
Sure. So one of the goals that we've had, and you called out the docs, Joe, is to try to spread out knowledge of the patterns and things that we have for the APIs. Some of that is built into custom resources. Like, custom resources don't support arbitrary sub-resources. So some of the conventions you have to follow if you're using custom resources. But a lot of them are still dependent on like the schema authors. And so we have some tooling for built-in API types, linters and round trip testers and compatibility checking, and some things that sort of help people who are developing built-in APIs without a reviewer or approver needing to even see it, right? Like, the CI jobs will tell you if you've broken round tripping.
Yeah.
And we have none of that for custom resources. And so, like, my main concern is what I would like to see primarily is getting some of those tools in place so that we find problems and aren't counting on human eyeballs to catch all of these issues. And so, but until we have that, like, it doesn't seem like a great approach to say, well, it's too slow to depend on human eyeballs, so let's just not.
I don't think that's the case. The problem is not that. The problem is governance and autonomy. So, like, we want to make sure that the expectations are clear. Like, when we created the organizational structure, KK had a bar. We wanted that bar to be high. We wanted to lock it down. And it was clear that we wanted to have certain expectations met. But we also felt that that bar could sometimes be too high for people to iterate fast, right? So we wanted to have a set of projects outside of the core to have the ability to iterate fast and break themselves, right, against the rocks. And that's okay, because part of that is innovating. And so we didn't want to have the same restrictions for core to be put on things that are outside. So that's the reason why we created the original governance model. And the current documentation has areas where it kind of cuts against that. And it instead of decentralizing, it centralizes again. So in my mind, it's just a matter of writing down, clarifying some of the original words that are inside the doc to make sure it's more explicit and a recommendation for things outside. And you know, we want people to follow best practices, because right now there's no way you could review, Jordan, it's not even humanly possible, the sheer number of sub-projects that have CRDs now. I think a lot of them would probably not be within up to snuff either. So it's just, we need to find a balance of policy as well as tooling that makes sense. That is,
yeah, and making it clear where the line is, so that if someone is in iterate fast and break things mode, you know, process doesn't get in their way, but at the same time, anyone who's consuming the thing that's iterating fast and breaking,
that expectation should be
definitely aware, like, oh, this is not supported, and I shouldn't build a business on top of this.
So, and I think,
like we have documentation around, you know, what does an alpha version mean? Like, you can drop support at any time. What does a beta version mean? What does a GA version mean? And so I think it makes sense to clarify, you know, if you're in alpha mode and it's unsupported, here's guidance for what namespace to use. And sure, like, iterate fast, knock yourself out, make it clear that you're moving fast and breaking things. At the point where you want to like have a stable published API, and you want it to be like part of the K8s.io namespace, right? Then here are the expectations. I would say the same expectations for around compatibility. We should hold CRD backed APIs to that, and then we can figure out like what's the best way to achieve those goals. And so that's going to be a mix of tooling and review, and hopefully tooling develops and hopefully review expertise develops, and we move forward that way.
I think that's totally fair too.
I mean, one of the concerns that, and maybe this is a straw man, so maybe I'm full of crap here, and feel free to tell me if that's the case, is that what exactly is in scope of an API review? Because I think a lot of times, and especially since the folks who are API approvers are overlapped with architectural roles in other places, I think we got to make it clear that during an API review, it's okay to say something like, you're not following the conventions via XYZ, or this name is not consistent with this other name over here, or like, you know, something along those lines, which is largely syntactical. What I don't want to have happen as part of an API review is something like, I don't like the way you modeled the solution of this problem. Right, and because I think that's mixing these two things, and so that's the concern that I have, and I would love to actually tighten up, you know, not only on blocking this appropriately, but also making sure that we tighten up sort of what's in scope and out of scope for an API review, and which stuff should be handled as part of the larger KEP process.
Is the real issue about, I don't like the way you modeled the problem, or is it, I don't think you should be solving this problem at all? Right? Because like, as a developer, if somebody's giving me feedback that, hey, I think there's a better way that you can model this problem, and they're doing it in a constructive way, whether they're an API reviewer or not, I'm going to actually be grateful for that feedback. Now, if the issue is we have people who are API reviewers who are also fulfilling an architectural governance role, who are coming in and telling individual SIGs, you should not be solving this problem, and they're a little out of place on doing that, I think that's a little bit different. And then the other thing that's kind of different between CRDs and built-in types is that the expectation for a KEP for a built-in type is that you have API review prior to even going alpha. Whereas with CRDs, if we're going to allow people to move fast and break stuff, maybe one thing we could do is say, okay, you don't need to have API approval going into alpha, but if you want to, like Jordan said, if you want to go beta or GA, you could have it. Those were the kind of the two thoughts that came up with you guys were.
I had some comments there, but Brian has his hand up.
Yeah, and I do want to call out what Clayton said in the chat, which is this discussion really belongs in SIG architecture. I also just want to point out that if you listen to everything that Jordan said, and he talked about reviewing for following the API conventions. So I think that concern is unfounded. Sometimes people wear multiple hats. And I think in those cases it's desirable. Like Tim put a lot of effort into reviewing the dual stack proposals, wearing his SIG networking hat. And he is also an API approver. So he also looked at the API aspects at the same time. So that is sometimes going to happen. And I personally think it's a non-issue for those to be overlapping. And in fact, it's kind of a goal to make sure that we have people who are reviewing the domain-specific concerns of the APIs, understand the API conventions enough to also do the API review. It doesn't have to be a separate person to go do that.
Okay, so regardless, I'm perfectly happy to take this up in SIG architecture. What I will say is that you said that it's part of SIG architecture's charter to cover API reviews. And the question,
the process and the standards.
Right, and then the question here is, what do we actually mean by API review? And I think that comes down to that sort of, are we talking semantics or syntax, right?
Yeah, that's clear to everybody who does the API reviews.
Okay, all right, then maybe it's not a real issue. So that's cool.
And I think, Joe, like to get to your original point, like we had early discussions for the first couple of years of Cube where we were trying to limit the scope of Kubernetes. As we've, and that was growing an ecosystem, allowing people to execute. We never really defined the gray area between outside and SIGs. To a degree, we struggled with Incubator, we struggled with associated projects, we struggled with Helm. So I do think there's an element here of the aspect of this that is the semantic part. We did delegate to SIGArch, but then we ran into challenges and we haven't necessarily closed the loop on, do we have an effective process for resolving semantic differences with consumers? Because I do think the role of SIGArch, my personal opinion would be the role of SIGArch is to help negotiate semantic disagreements about the meaning of what is Kubernetes, which maybe API review is being used to enforce that today, but reasonably we could do a better job of talking about the semantics and the why in SIGArch.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like if there's a semantic question, then the KEP process, SIGArch, it should be going that way. It shouldn't sort of like land on these, 5-6 people to essentially like API approver does not equal, architectural master, right? And I just want to make sure that we don't accidentally create that equivalency.
Yeah, one of the things that we called out in the doc was trying to distinguish between those two things. Like the KEP is primarily focused at the SIG or SIGs that are over that area. And so they're the ones who are saying, this is a thing we think is worth doing. It's within our area, it's within our charter. Here are the goals. And then the API process is saying, is this working coherently? And like, have we done the same thing in other places? Let's do it consistently. And are you going to run into compatibility issues? That type of thing. So it was very much trying to say, like, before it even touches API review, you should have a KEP, like the tech leads for that sub-project should have said, this is the thing we're doing and it makes sense and it's a goal and we agree with this direction. So
yeah, no, and that's great. If folks don't think it's a concern, it's not a concern. We'll see how it goes. I did not see this particular semantics versus syntax type of thing in the current API review process document.
Yeah, so clarifying that is certainly something that's welcome. I think Tim said he was going to take a stab at adding stuff in.
Sorry again, I'm late.
Sorry, taking notes. Who said they were taking a stab at something?
Tim St. Clair said he would.
No, all good.
Yeah, I shake the hornet's nest. I should be responsible.
I think that silence means we're done.
Are you sure?
I'll stop talking.
All right.
Caleb has his
Seconded.
hand up.
Passed.
Wait, Caleb, do you have your hand up, or is that just like the little Zoom hand that you accidentally clicked?
I did have my hand up. It was to talk about the the API review, but it's fine. I think it's covered.
All right. Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.